Hi, welcome to Thomasville Center for the Arts, second Saturday. Today we are at the Contemporary Art and Ideas Lecture with Dr. Ann Albritton. Dr. Ann Albritton is an art historian who is retired professor of art history at Rekindle College of Art and Design. We also have Christina Anduiza with us today. She's the curator here at Thomasville Center for the Arts and also a contemporary artist herself who explores improvisation, video, and the intersection with video and paint. Christina, do I have that right a little bit?
I think that, yeah.
Something like that. Today's topic is industry and invention. So Dr. Albritton will be talking to us about how contemporary art both pushes and pulls industry and invention in different ways. So we're excited to get started and have a conversation. As always, we invite you to come and join us in person. These videos are also online. It's a part of a series on contemporary art and ideas. Welcome.
Thank you, thank you. This is by a famous French printmaker named Grandville in the early 19th century. Let's put out the light and rekindle the fire. I took this from an article, from an essay by Patricia Minardi on Grandville Vision and Dreams. And you see here a group of people dressed as clerics and with bellows for heads, the ones in front, making the fire grow larger, and figures near the back with candle snuffers to put out the light. So it's about burning books, burning ideas, and trying to squelch that fire. You made an interesting comment on it, Katie. Would you like to?
Do you have that? Do you need?
It's up to you.
Okay. Yeah, and I think this is a great print to start on, and I'm not sure where in history or how far after the printing press this was made, but as bookmaking was really an invention that changed the world, and when we're talking about burning that invention or burning the ideas is really a great way to start this conversation, because I think that's really what we're looking at is how art represents ideas that can either spread or be put out, which is really fascinating right now when we talk about TikTok and social media and different governments trying to limit that and the benefits of limiting it in some ways and the downsides of that, limiting expression. So yeah, I think this is a great place to start our conversation.
Good. Then along came Prince Albert. And many of us are really familiar with Prince Albert if we watched the Victoria miniseries on PBS this past couple of years or so. His idea was for this great building to be a universal exhibition space. And he had the architect, Sir Joseph Paxton, design this building, and it was possible because of the development of cast iron. And so with cast iron and plate glass, this huge palace was built in Hyde Park in London. And it was called the first universal exhibition space. There is discussion about that. Not all countries agree that London and England had the first space. But there were agricultural and commercial exhibitions from around the world. There was some art, some sculpture mainly. But you can see photographs, actually, of this exhibition where you have halls full of people, full of exhibitions, full of people looking at the newest things. And the 1850s, very exciting times. You have the railroads, you have all these developments, and you have photography, clearly. It's been around since the 1830s. So you have a lot going on at this time for both industry and invention.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about the Crystal Palace as being, are we talking about the building itself as being the contemporary art that is driving industry and invention, or is it the work that is being exhibited in the Crystal Palace?
All of it.
All of it, okay.
All of it. It gave a place to bring people together from around the world. You had enormous groups of people from Japan, and Japan was isolated at this time. It wasn't until 1853 that Admiral Perry from the U.S. forced the Japanese harbor to open to U.S. ships. But so this was amazing that people were coming from all over the world, bringing their developments to show. So it's also where, for the first time, you have sort of a global exchange, a real universal global exchange. Maybe not totally global, but more than they had before.
So we're kind of talking about a convention center that might be in the same way that Tesla or Steve Jobs would show the latest Macs. This is whatever the latest and greatest in industry and invention is being shown here.
Or maybe, in addition to Steve Jobs, all the other tech companies together.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which
So a big convention.
Yeah, which was huge. I know, especially before the internet, there really wasn't that's like, I know periods and styles were kind of isolated to different areas. And now that if people were able to come and see all these things in one place, I'm sure that only spurred that further. It was interesting.
Right, you always think of trade routes and how those were sort of the idea spreaders, you know, those areas that were the central trade routes, and this is kind of doing the same thing, just that exchange, idea exchange that's happening here must have been pretty incredible.
So I'm going to jump from mid-19th century to early 20th century, and you might notice that I'm leaving out Picasso, certainly one of the great inventors, but in a different context in a way. So I'm leaving out so much of the early development of painting in the early 20th century, going instead to Dada, which was a further break with traditional art. Ever since the mid-19th century, you've had this beginning to break with the Renaissance, beginning to break away from great traditions, and to flatten space, to change space. And here, these are ready-mades. These are things that already exist. On your left, pre-Dada by a year, Marcel Duchamp took a bicycle wheel and nailed it to a kitchen stool. I mean, there's nothing that he's really made except putting the wheel on the stool, but he created something new. And it's important, Dada was an art movement started in Zurich in 1916. A group of artists, poets, literary people, all sorts, got together at a Café Voltaire in Zurich. And this Dada movement came out of there. It was in opposition to World War I. World War I was one of the most terrible, terrible wars in history. Mm-hmm. And these people were so upset about World War I. So many artists had already been killed in the war. And so their negative reaction to the horrors of war, and it's often satirical and nonsensical. How can you react to war? What can you do? You can be angry, but these artists are trying to show it in their work. One was even a famous poet, in fact more than one, several, what they call Zaun poetry, in which they just babble, stand up on the stage and babble. In fact, I had a friend who did a PhD in German literature, did Zaun and babbled. So Duchamp was one of the leaders. He left France for the United States, went to New York, and was part of the founding of a group called Société Anonyme. And it doesn't really mean anonymous society, it really means corporation. But the Americans didn't really know or care. They liked the name Société Anonyme. And so they had a non-juried show. And Duchamp went to a hardware store, bought a urinal, turned it upside down, up on its side, and signed it Arma 1917 and entered it in the Société Anonyme show. And it was rejected. He never put his name to it. He was trying not to be connected with it because he knew if he were, they would accept it. But they didn't know, so they didn't accept it. Alfred Stieglitz, great photographer, put it on a stand and photographed it and said, "There's art. It's a sculpture on a stand." And it wasn't until many years later that Duchamp acknowledged that it was his work. But perfect Dada kind of thing, sort of thumbing your nose at societal norms at a core.
Christina, as a practicing artist and somebody who's been through art school, how much do you feel like artists today are influenced by these sort of early anti-authority artists, and how much is that sort of taught and just coming out in the art that is being produced in art schools today?
I think that's a great question. I think it also depends on what school you go to and what type of professors you study with. But I would say it's a huge influence in the type of artwork we see today, because when they were making this work, they were like, what was extremely inventive about it is that they were taking objects that already existed, barely altering them and calling them art. And so in that break of tradition, like, we've broken tradition so many times now that like now you can really do anything. You know, there's not much there to break away from, because we have like expanded into accepting so many different types of work and being comfortable with like identifying them as art. And there's just kind of also been a breakaway from like a central idea of a group of people defining what is and is not art or whatever. So I think it's definitely influenced the course of history and how art is practiced now. Were you going to say something?
Following up on what Christina is saying, you have to remember, 1915, a man did not go out of his house without his hat. Not a baseball cap, a real hat, a felt hat or a straw hat in the summer. It was required to have your head covered. Women had their head covers. Women did not go out women didn't wear slacks at all. In the 1850s, 40s and 50s, the French artist Rose Bonheur had to have permission to wear pants because she painted horses and cows. But it's such rigid rules. And in art, the rigid rules started being broken here. But they actually went on into the 1980s, especially for women. So the exciting thing about now is that it is pretty wide open.
Yeah.
But it started.
And how much of this sort of art in the Dada movement had to do with the new materials and new methods of creation that were being pushed by the Industrial Revolution?
Urinals, I don't know the history of it. But the bicycle had been around for a good part of the 19th century, but it was still pretty exciting, I would think, in 1915. And the urinal as art was just absolutely insane at 1917.
Yeah.
Another artist fascinated with machines, an American, Francis Picabia, also part of Dada. He lived mostly in France. And this is his fille née sans mère, daughter born without a mother, sort of a virgin birth. But it's also a metamorphosis of machines and sexuality. And on your right is his amorous parade. He actually named them all in French, Parade Amoureuse. But one thing Artsy.net said about Picabia, the genius of the modern world is machinery. And just what you mentioned, Katie, a minute ago about the machine. And Picabia is surely showing us that. Yeah. And the pumping of the machine, it's a real machine dealing with sexuality.
Mm-hmm. And did he mostly illustrate machines and like study them? Were they mostly like paintings that he did?
No,
or did he work? He made the machines. So these are sketches of like machines.
He sketched real machinery, but then he made designs.
Okay.
He did a wonderful one of Alfred Stieglitz, the photographer, and it's like a camera that's sort of deflated. And so you wonder what he's trying to say about Stieglitz there. So it's he's very clever. They're often puns. They're funny and risque.
and I'm sorry, I'm very literal and not maybe abstract of a thinker, enough of an abstract thinker to make this connection, but it's the idea that machineries are producing stuff without this sort of sexual precursor, or that machines make objects without a parent. I mean, daughter born without a mother. I guess machines are creating object after object versus an artisan who actually creates a functional thing.
I'm not sure if it's that literal.
Okay.
He also did wonderful paintings and sketches of things too. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
He might have just been painting.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know. Do you have any idea about that, Christina? I don't want to close it
No,
out.
I think that is an interesting point to make, but it feels like the attitude with which like making it about sexuality and about puns and about like humor feels like he's looking at machinery with like an attitude of like, I don't know, like it feels like it's more of like the way people were perceiving the world as it was adapting that way. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Okay.
I think so. And then in Russia, in the Soviet Union actually, after the Russian Revolution in 1917, for a few years, Russia was really open to experimental, avant-garde, constructivist work. They had an art commissar named Lunacharsky who wanted art in the service of the revolution, but very, very modern art. This was squelched a few years later when Lenin came in. Not when Lenin came in, when Lenin died. But anyway, this is Popova, a wonderful abstract painter, but this is her set designed for a play called The Magnanimous Cuckold. And plays and performance became very, very important at this time. But just showing you the mechanical kinds of things, invention there's a sense of absurdity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And further in the Soviet period, you have fashion. Fashion also needed to serve the revolution. And on your right, I was thinking of, if you've been watching the French Open or something, you see all kinds of tennis costumes today. But here you have costumes designed specifically for the sport of tennis. And sometimes, though I don't have an image of it, sometimes the fabrics actually had little tennis rackets on them, different things. On your left, you have this very authoritarian kind of female figure wearing an apron. In the center, though, you have more high fashion. But the importance of everything for the revolution. After Lenin died and Lunacharsky was no longer a commissar, things became the social realism that we're familiar with from Russia. But this period was very, very exciting in Russian history.
Mm-hmm.
Then back to Dada, and those fit sort of in Dada somehow too. We have Man Ray, who was an American photographer and artist. He made some very interesting sculptures. And one of these is this metronome. And I had always seen it and shown it, but I assumed it was a metronome like you put on a piano or on a table about this tall. And the eye on the rod there is the eye of a beautiful female photographer named Lee Miller, who had rejected Man Ray. And so he puts her eye on the metronome there. A few years ago, I was in Madrid, and at the Reina Sofia Museum, their wonderful, wonderful museum, I walked up to this and was just totally shocked. There is the Man Ray metronome, taller than I am. It must be about over 7 feet tall. And it was crazy. So I asked the friends I was with to photograph me standing beside it. It was called Indestructible Object at times, but at other times it was called Object to be Destroyed. And it was destroyed in 1923, which is another Dada kind of idea. but then rebuilt in 1964. So that is just showing scale is so important in art and invention too.
When this was being exhibited, was the metronome on where the eye was going back and forth? Do you
Not
think?
when I saw it.
Okay.
I've only ever seen it in still photo, so I
Okay.
don't know. I imagine it did when he first made it, but I don't know. Sophie Taueber-Arp. She was Sophie Tauber. She married young Arp. And she was one of the people in the Dada movement in Zurich. She was a school teacher. She did performance. She did dance. She did costumes. And on your left, you see her with one of these Dada heads. And on next to it, you see a Dada head with color. She did a variety of these Dada heads, sort of like a blockhead or a dumb head or something, that's not alive, but she enlivens it with color. This sort of center photograph is she visited her sister in the United States. Her sister was living in the States, and she was fascinated with Native Americans. And here she did 2 costumes of Hopi Indian influence. And then on the right is Taueber-Arp in one of her costumes and performance. But really fascinating woman as part of the Dada movement. Women were still not afforded the same privileges as men, but they did have a few women in Dada. And then the second piece of architecture I'm showing, a huge influence on industry and invention. The Bauhaus. This is the Walter Gropius Bauhaus in Dessau, Germany, built between 1925 and 1926. The Bauhaus actually started in Weimar. Totally different design building, more like a hangar or an airplane hangar or something. But here the new architecture by Gropius. And Bauhaus means building house. So their idea was form follows function. And designers of all types, the architecture itself, the actual structure of the building was only part of the building. Everything in it, and including the people who worked in it, were all part of the Bauhaus. Here are a couple of pictures. One is a poster on your left, and on your right is the Vasily chair by Marcel Breuer. And Breuer was very interested in tubular steel, and that chair looks contemporary today, doesn't it? You can still buy it, that chair. A design, fabrication that's still being manufactured, the Vasily chair. Some things about the Bauhaus, I made a list for this because there's so many interesting things about it that were important and have been for all of modern architecture. No border between the artist and craftsperson. The artist is an exalted craftsperson. Form follows function. Nothing like Baroque or Renaissance and Gothic. The complete work of art, a synthesis of multiple forms, true materials. They should reflect the nature of objects. You don't take something and make it look like something else. Minimalism with linear and geometric forms, emphasis on technology, smart use of resources, simplicity and effectiveness, and constant development. So you see so much of that here. Wonderful window treatment that you could see reflected in Frank Lloyd Wright's house at Polyglot, and you can see other influences all over the world. And you can still see contemporary architects using Bauhaus ideas.
It's interesting. It's interesting that, like, the idea of form over function in Bauhaus, you would think that someone focusing on, like, the function you would think that that's like how objects and like houses and things were already made, but actually in focusing more on the function and like the inventive part of it, like it became artful in a new way. Like those, if you look at things from the Bauhaus, you're like, oh, that looks like art, you know. And it's interesting that focusing specifically on the inventive function side, they ended up producing things that like were artful, which I feel like that divide between like, are you just going to make something practical or are you going to make it art? I think it's interesting that they were challenging that, and by making it as practical as possible, it actually became like beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. I was telling Anne, this almost seems like a playlist for Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, all of these standards for the Bauhaus movement. But it's also hard to remember that before this movement, you were coming out of a period of architecture not being, you think of buildings as purely functional. I think that is such a modern mindset where you think of ornate columns and how architecture was really an exhibition of the materials and the artists of the time before this era. And so it's hard in our modern mindset, I think, to think of what it must have been, what a break from tradition this movement must have been, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it does now seem like such a contemporary idea, and one that all of our technologists right now are using. I think that our iPads should be beautiful objects, that we enjoy interacting with.
The dishes they used, the knives and forks they used, the clothes they wore, everything fit the aesthetic. And that was really terribly important. They had someone who just worked on color. They had other people who worked on design of clothing, on textiles. Every part, we don't tend to think about that in connection.
So the Bauhaus movement was not just about buildings and furniture, it included textiles.
It was like an entire lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
It was all of it. That's why I'm showing Annie Albers here.
Oh, that's great.
Annie Albers was the wife of Joseph Albers, who was a great colorist. And they left in the 30s. They left, the Bauhaus ended about 1932, 33, Hitler coming to power. And the Albers first went to Black Mountain College in North Carolina, and then later to Yale, where he was teaching at Yale. But this shows Annie Albers weaving at Black Mountain College. And weaving had been very important also in the Bauhaus. And on your right, you have a piece of her work called Intersecting. She's had a couple of major retrospective exhibitions in the United States in the last few years, but important part of the Bauhaus. And there were women connected with, again, not given the importance of men, but still in connection. And then we're into the 50s in the United States with abstract expressionism. And Willem de Kooning was from the Netherlands, left there, came to New York, where he participated very much in the abstract expressionist scene there. Very gestural, a new idea of a woman. I read something about, written by Audrey Flack, who is a female artist who was started very big in the late 20th century, still working today. And she talks about de Kooning in Amsterdam seeing brothels and seeing women looking out of storefronts. But she talks about looking at this and marveling at the complexity of paint. De Kooning was one who really knew how to handle paint. He's famous for his manipulation of paint. But she said, most recently I stood before women and bicycle at the Whitney Museum and marveled at the beauty and complexity. It kept me riveted. These paintings have continued to vibrate through the years with the hatred and love that de Kooning felt for all women. And that pulsation has given them a powerful afterlife. Now that's one artist's opinion, but I thought it was really interesting. It sort of brings it to life. Very, very gestural, Sometimes the Kooning used toothpaste as mouth. Sometimes they described the teeth of these women as chiclets. De Kooning once even said they're self-portraits. So their exploration of the body. Picasso had also spent years working and approaching the female body, but here's another way, much more gestural way that de Kooning is doing.
It's so helpful, Anne, when you're looking at this, for you to place this in context and give us sort of the artist's intention, background, but then also to have another artist's opinion of how they view it. And Christina, I was curious how you would view this art if you were in a gallery and came upon this work. How do you just look at this blankly and decipher what the artist is trying to say? And what would you gather from this this piece when you look at it?
I think that's a great question, and it's also just like a difficult question because I think, I also think that seeing it in person, like, I think it helps. Something that's helpful about the in-person explanation is you don't get like the texture of the paint, like the interactions of the colors of the paint, like really, you don't see physically like all of the detail of the actual piece, so you can't react to it on that emotional level. So I think that, I think that first, like understanding when it was made can kind of give you context of like what was happening at that time with the art was being made. But then also, I mean, I think that like the way an artist would react to it and then the way that just a non-artist would react to it in person are both like just as valuable, because you're really supposed to be able to stand in front of something and just, it really is an experience of a communication through like what the artist has just made. So it's hard for me to say like specifically with this piece because I'm not in front of it to like describe what it would be like in real life, but I really do enjoy hearing kind of the description of someone who can, who's really making an effort to just be with and connect with it. Because I think that's the difference of if you're like just allowing yourself to be with the art and just look at it and respond to it.
Are we supposed to see the bicycle in this? Are we supposed to see a bicycle in this? I don't see the bicycle in the painting. And maybe that's something.
If you go up close, you can see the circles of the wheel.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, and you can't, the woman, the main thing you see are breasts, and you can see some feet, legs and feet, and a skirt maybe. It's not totally literal.
Yeah. But again, hearing what you said about the Colgate smile and the chiclets, I would not have noticed that on first glance, but it is fun to.
Yeah, it is fun when you really look at it, and the eyes are very, glaring eyes. So yeah. So this is, and then we're looking at another French artist in New York, Jean Tinguely. His homage to New York in 1960. The Museum of Modern Art asked him to produce a video for their sculpture garden. Tinguely was asked to produce a machine performance in the sculpture garden at the Museum of Modern Art in 1960. And this is called a self-destroying mechanism, because like some of those earlier machines we were looking at, what's it designed to do? To self-destroy, to break up and burn. And it's homage to New York, but it's homage to the city, this wonderful city. And we're told it keeps rebuilding from time to time, so you have this constant movement and destruction and rebuilding. So this is Jean Tinguely. And Tinguely is famous for fountains and mechanisms. His work is in one of the fountain next to the Pompidou Center in Paris. Interesting artist. Now.
And is the self-destruction, that's really part of the artist's statement, that we are creating these machines that in the end up destroying ourselves and the machine itself, is that?
Yeah, and it's also about this great city that's constantly being rebuilt. and maybe not that little, it also has a bit of the fluxus. What fluxus is a look back at Donna. So you have this idea of absurdity too. Fichte and Weiss, or the way things go. And this is one that Christina and I had both thought would be so good for this. Work and don't work.
And they're also creating, they're inventing something. So it feels like you're in like this like garage, like inventor's space, but you think about like what, like you would think, why are they doing, like what's the purpose of this? And I feel like I think something about industry and invention also makes us think about work and labor.
Yeah.
And the amount of time and labor that went into producing this, just for it kind of undoes everything that we think about like productivity and like labor and invention and like why we engage in these type of things. So I think, but it's also just so fun to watch because you like every moment you can't believe that it's still like that it's still working and that it's still happening. I think it's a fun example of the way they're kind of inverting the idea of invention and like work and factory work and things like that.
Yeah, that's a pretty fascinating point to bring in the labor that goes into this and industry in general. But it also just makes me think about the chain of events and the domino effect of everything. Anytime I say Rube Goldberg type device, it's,
Exactly.
What is this begetting next? And I think that's what industry and invention is, right? It's one idea feeding off the other and kind of this cataclysmic effect of ideas.
They've worked together for a good many years and have created all kinds of things and different little sculptures of people doing different things. The last work I saw of theirs, but this is such a, again, it sort of takes all of the kinds of things we've looked at and put them together. And it does fit in fact a little bit in the Fluxus and Dada way coming forward. I wanted to include Alison Starr, who is a mixed race artist. She considers herself African American, and she has done this series called Heresies, where she uses hairstyles of African Americans and explores them, sometimes in life-size sculptures like on the right, or even this one giant blue figure with hair like we see at the head on the left, but exploring race, exploring identity, and at the same time being very inventive with natural elements, with natural pieces of wood and objects. I've just always sort of liked to follow Alison Starr. And then one of the really exciting artists around the world still today is 91-year-old Yayoi Kusama. And on the left is the artist with a pumpkin and a room full of dots, and the dot is very much her signature. She came to New York in the 1950s, late 1950s, and was very excited about abstract expressionism. But she started seeing dots on things even as a child, looking at flowers and all, she would see dots. She has some kind of mental condition and lives actually in Japan, I think in Tokyo now, in a mental hospital, but has a huge studio and shows all over the world. There's a picture of her in the upper right, and also on the right is one of these rooms. And the rooms are very, very exciting. I was in one in the Tampa Museum a couple of years ago, and it was totally different figures. It was not the dots, it was abstract figures. But you think you're in a huge space, and actually you're in a very small space with mirrors all around. So you just see these large, large areas of dots, and then you see yourself reflected in them, and other people too. You see things moving around, but Kusama is extremely popular, extremely well known, and but she's becoming best known for these rooms, and they're called infinity rooms. Have you ever seen any of her work for real?
I haven't seen any of her work. I do remember, I have friends that have gone to her exhibitions, and I think it's just very fun and interactive because you're in her world. You know, you're in that space, and that space is something entirely different. Mm-hmm. And the way it can kind of like trick you into seeing other things, which is interesting with her background.
She's done sculptures too. She's done sculptures with all kinds of objects hanging off them, balloons and things. She's very, very creative, and she has actually worked constantly all of this, of the last half of the 20th century and into this. She's still working at 91.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting you said with a mental disorder, and you almost wonder, does it take a little bit of that, or being somewhere on either side of this normal spectrum of mental health to create like she does, and to really push ideas in a different direction? Because if we all exist just without these questions or within the same mindset, then we're really not pushing or pulling anybody along. So it's fascinating to know that that is the mental space that she operates in, and how that's influenced her work would be an interesting study.
Mm-hmm. The last time I was at the Venice Biennale was in 2015, and Sarah Z, originally from Boston, was the U.S. American artist for that. Most major countries have their own house, their own building in the Venice Biennale area. And this is the US. It's a very classical style building, and you see the name in Latin, Estati Uniti, on the building. Z is doing something really quite different there. Most artists, the first time I went to Venice, to the Biennale, was at least 10 years before that. Ed Ruscha had these very lovely paintings all around the room. And most of the artists have been sculptors or painters, sculptors and painters. I think Martin Puryear was the last, the 2017 artist, or maybe 2019, I don't remember. But anyway, very, very important. What has she done? She has come outside the building. She has made work that goes out from the building, and she calls it triple point in places. And she has interior rooms, and she calls this one the planetarium, sort of reflecting the universe, perhaps. And this is part of the exterior. There's so much. I could show you 100 photographs of this, because the outside also there were huge, what looked like rocks, enormous rocks, but you could pick them up. You weren't picking them up, but I mean they were light enough to remove and pick up. There was room after room of this kind of thing. There were things spread all over the floor, but really very, very interesting artist. At the end is when the visitor, you wander around all the rooms. In the end, you come to what's called the observatory. And it's a garden-like space. And she makes it part of the triple point. So you have 3 points, and then I'm not showing you this garden space. But fascinating artist. On Art 21, there's an interesting video of Sarah Z working on the High Line in New York City. Mm-hmm. So somebody to look at. Again, you see taking the machine, taking design still further from where we first started with Dada, up through Fluxus and up to 2015. Nick Cave is a Chicago artist, an African American, who makes delightful sound suits. All kinds. I have a couple of video to show you that shows some of these, and you can hear the sound actually from them. So he's certainly influenced by different African tribal costumes and performance. He teaches in Chicago. He's one of the very exciting artists today, and you can also watch, besides this YouTube, you can also see him on Art 21.
That was beautiful.
Yeah. And all the suits actually themselves make sound, right? That's like the thought behind them. So they're almost like an instrument as an extension of your body, but they're also like
you see a horn with this.
Yeah.
And sometimes, but sometimes it's the grasses and things in the suits that make
that first one that was in the video, right?
Yeah.
And so much of this seems about performance art too. So when he's on exhibition, is there somebody wearing the suits and doing the dances, or is the video itself the art?
I've seen them several ways. I've seen them mainly showing 1 to 3 sound suits, or sometimes a whole row of sound suits, and then a video playing showing how they work. Because for most art museums, it's too expensive. Well, smaller museums to have dancers come in and perform. And I imagine that Cave is careful with who wears his sound suits.
It is such a beautiful integration, though, of visual art, sound art,
And
movement.
Yeah.
I mean, just everything that he puts in there. It works beautifully together.
Great invention. Another artist I wanted to show you, Katharina Grosse, a German artist. She entitled this, It Wasn't Us. But she's using paint in radically different ways. Sometimes it's paint just put around on the floor like you see on the left. Sometimes it's pure pigment. The first time I saw her work, there was just pigment in different streaks of colors. She was asked in an interview with Art 21 how she began moving into space like this. And she said, I started to use other surfaces other than the canvas. We usually think of painting as something on the wall that you can move and put somewhere else. And why not just make the painting on the wall and part of the wall, part of the situation? That painting could sit anywhere. It could be in a corner, it could be fluid, like a film, it could be moving, and it has no site. So the thing about site-specific, this is actually site-specific because it's here, but she's also saying this has no site. You can put it anywhere. And in fact, Art 21 video shows sculptures that she made with collaboration from people in the community in a park in a city, and really, really quite interesting. So Katharina Grosse. Now Pierre Huyghe is a French artist who spent a lot of time in the United States and done some interesting things here. He did this piece for Streamside Day. And it's sort of like Walt Disney Town is its centennial, it's Disney town. Well, Streamside Day was a town that was built from nothing, just out in a certain place in nature. And he found it, and he thought they needed a celebration for this, and a celebration he could design that they could use every year. And so he starts with a video. It all is part of a video, and Art 21 has the video. But in the first part of the video, you see a little rabbit, then you see a little fawn walking into the house. So you see this incorporation of nature into civilization, and then you see civilization into nature. But one of the important things he does is design a parade. So they can have a parade, they have snow cones and cotton candy and people selling things. They have the fire department. You see the fire truck back here, and the school bus, the mail, the people who deliver mail, the post office, everything here. And it gives them something they can use every year. It's all filmed, it's all planned, and they can just pull out the plans this one day a year and have their celebration designed by a famous artist, Pierre Huyghe. He's done many very clever things. He had a disagreement with Harvard about a building, and he looked back at Corbusier's argument with Harvard about a building, so he did puppets, very big puppets, and a model of the building, and has this argument going on about Harvard and architecture. He's one of these fascinating inventors.
And I love that we're talking about inventing when we think of like machines and industrial things, but he's inventing celebration. And the way that he's also, like, you look, there's like workers' trucks and fire trucks. It's really something that's for the town, that's for everyone there. So yeah, I think that that's a really interesting way to be using invention and to bringing like artful things and integrating it into real life.
Yeah.
It also feels like there's some fun juxtaposition with any planned community, and you can kind of see the houses in the background and how sort of formulaic maybe they look, and then just to have this almost absurd artist, very well-known artist, but to bring an element of surprise to what feels very sort of concrete and not surprising.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Does it make fun of this plant community too? Is there a bit of, I don't know, he doesn't talk about that.
Yeah.
But there is a little bit, is it, this highbrow, he's not highbrow really, but he is well-known major French artist. Is it sort of saying, or is it embracing it?
Right. And the fact that he chose this place, and felt the need to put a celebration in this place, isn't just that he saw a blank canvas that he could really put something fun into. So maybe he saw it as an opportunity.
Yeah, could be.
Yeah.
Could be. So I want to wrap this up with a great architect who actually died just a few years ago, Zaha Hadid, Iranian-British architect. The Beijing airport, as it was under construction, it's called a starfish design. And this magnificent airport. And this is the interior of it.
Wow.
Whereas we've come a long way from the Bauhaus, so we've left that particular type of geometry, the rectangular building, the traditional window, even though those windows were innovative, and this what we would call futuristic design. Hadid was not bound by rules. Maybe she was inspired by someone like Frank Gehry, who had already started bending rules in architecture, but hers go much further. And highly respected as a woman in the architectural field. I think also she was the first woman to win the Architectural Pritzker Prize, and unfortunately died about 4 years ago, relatively young.
The building feels very feminine, doesn't it?
Does.
The curvaceous sort of softness of it, at least compared to maybe the Bauhaus structures that we saw, which were so angular. This feels a little more
Beijing has some very, very exciting architecture. Some of it was done for the Olympics when it was in China a few years ago. There's a bird cage designed partly by Ai Weiwei. They've been innovative with architectural design.
Well, Anne, you have taken us through quite a long journey of art and how industry and invention has been pushed and pulled in different ways. But it seems like all of this art is really just a vehicle for ideas, and so certainly has a good place in this lecture series. Any final thoughts from either of you before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I don't know if I have any final thoughts. I think I think it's just interesting. It's just interesting to see how industry and invention will continue to be kind of incorporated in art. I feel like it's all over, you know, and I think that that's something that all of these different examples have shown is like how much really, I mean, the idea of invention, for example, like making art go hand in hand about the idea of like creating something new and ways that also is kind of interacting with the industry and like global developments and technology and all that stuff. It kind of almost, hearing you talk about it has shown ways that it's really woven into a lot of what we see.
Yeah, it's almost like everybody had to think like an artist in the creation of something new, any new invention. Yeah, the artist is creator.
Yeah, I think it's really important to realize the importance of art, artists, and creativity in industry. I'm wearing a plastic necklace today, and I didn't think about this until this morning even to talk about, but plastic has been such a huge invention and has been so useful and at the same time so terrible. Such a challenge, such a problem. But this is by the use of plastic by a French artist. And I thought, okay, here's plastic for good use. Whereas the dangers of plastic water bottles we looked at in our last book, The Environment. So the inventions and the industry can be both positive and have negatives, and we need to watch.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to next time where you'll be joining us with a lecture on migration and immigration inspired by the work of exhibiting artist Tom Swanston. So we hope you'll come back and join us either in person or on our website at thomasvillearts.org. Thank you, Dr. Albritton.